Hello folks, tonight we begin with a story that smells faintly of burnt flour and quiet resentment. It is the story of medieval baking, not how they made bread, but where they were allowed to make it. Because in the Middle Ages, the act of baking a loaf in the wrong oven was not just discouraged, it could get a person fined, evicted, or, depending on the steward's mood, publicly humiliated and forced to pay in livestock. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's watching history collapse from across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early medieval countryside, bread was not just a staple food, it was a social contract. And nowhere was that contract more bizarre than in the system of banalité, the lord's legal right to control essential communal infrastructure. This included watermills, wine presses, and most famously ovens. Peasants were forbidden to own or operate their own bread ovens. They had to use the one provided by their landlord, for a fee, of course, not a symbolic fee, not a community contribution, a mandatory enforced payment for each loaf, often collected in eggs, coins, or, on unlucky occasions, part of next year's barley. The oven itself, known as the four banal in French territories, was typically a dome of stone or brick large enough to bake for the entire village. In theory, it was a practical communal space. In reality, it was a bottleneck of frustration, long queues, unpredictable baking times, and a firekeeper with the personality of cold porridge. Villagers would wait for hours with their raw dough wrapped in damp cloth, hoping their turn came before nightfall, or rain. Because yes, it rained, and yes, the oven was sometimes outside. Most firekeepers were unimpressed with complaints. They rarely smiled, often scowled, and seemed to consider undercooked loaves a moral failing. There was no quality guarantee. If the crust was blackened or the center was raw, too bad. The loaf had touched the Lord's fire, and that was all the law required. Records survive of villagers fined for willful crust irregularity, unauthorized souring, or suspected independent leavening. These were not crimes of state. These were crimes against manorial dignity. The fines were not small. In England, fines could reach a shilling or more, roughly equivalent to a week's earnings. In some regions, refusal to use the communal oven resulted in expulsion from tenancy, a particularly bold form of culinary eviction. There are even tales of peasants disguising private ovens as storage sheds, only to be discovered when the steward noticed unusually cheerful crusts and an uptick in neighborhood morale. The steward naturally played a central role, a sort of bread auditor. He walked the village with a ledger and an eye for ash. If smoke rose from an unapproved chimney, he investigated. If a loaf looked suspiciously well risen, he asked questions. If a widow claimed her bread had simply fallen into the coals, he asked more. Some stewards were fair, others were petty tyrants who used oven rights to settle old grievances or simply pass a boring afternoon. In some villages, the steward had keys to the oven door and only unlocked it during designated hours. Late arrivals were turned away. Dough left overnight was discarded or sold to neighbors if the firekeeper was feeling entrepreneurial. Bread wasn't just food, it was identity. A family's loaf shape might signal heritage, tradition, or superstition. Flat, round, braided, cross-scored, each variation was a story. Yet the communal oven made all bread alike. Loaves blurred together on the long wooden peels, their crusts stamped with soot and monotony. Some resisted, quietly. A handful of peasants experimented with flatbreads cooked on stones. One village tried baking in flower pots, another wrapped dough in cabbage leaves and buried it in hot compost. These strategies rarely worked. Compost baking, it turns out, smells worse than success. But the real rebellion was the private oven. These small, personal constructions, usually a dome of clay over brick, were hidden behind sheds, under hay, or even inside homes disguised as heat sources. Clandestine ovens were a dangerous game. Discovery meant a heavy fine or loss of tenancy. Yet people tried. Bread is persistent. So were they. Historians still argue whether these rules were universally enforced. Some suggest the severity varied by region and century. Others claim the enforcement was less about practicality and more about maintaining hierarchy. The oven, in this reading, was symbolic. To bake without permission was to reject feudal order, like skipping a tax or refusing to bow. There's even record of a French peasant fined not for baking, but for thinking about baking in a private oven. The steward, perhaps emboldened by boredom, cited the intent to conspire in culinary isolation. No one knows if the man ever made the bread, but he paid. The rules extended beyond baking. The same system applied to mills and presses. Villagers were required to grind grain at the lord's mill and press grapes at his press. Doing otherwise was theft of his monopoly, not the resources. In theory, the lord's infrastructure made life easier. In practice, it made life narrower. Still, the system endured for centuries. Across kingdoms and empires, loaves passed through these ovens like grains through an hourglass, each one taxed, tracked, and tolerated. During times of crisis, famine, plague, or war, the oven became a focal point of anxiety. When grain was scarce, oven usage dropped, and stewards grew paranoid. Bread became thinner, flatter, more bitter. In some cases, people began baking root vegetable loaves or acorn meal breads, which the oven master charged extra to clean the flavor from the stone. In the 14th century, one monastery took over oven duties for its local village. They charged less, offered flexible hours, and even smiled. The villagers responded by bringing gifts: honey, beer, turnips. The steward responded by suing the monastery. He lost. The court cited excessive crust-based control, a phrase which for a brief moment became famous enough to appear in poetry. Women bore much of the burden. In most households, they prepared the dough, managed the timing, and handled the steward's scrutiny. A burnt loaf was a domestic failure. An unauthorized bake was a legal one. In some manors, widows were denied access to the oven unless a male relative vouched for them. Bread, like so much else, was patriarchal. Still, daily life went on. Children scavenged burnt crusts near the oven. Dogs lingered for crumbs. Arguments flared over who cut the queue. But there were also jokes, songs, and gossip exchanged in the long wait. The oven, like the market, was a social hub, just one wrapped in smoke, heat, and legal obligation. Over time, things began to change. Peasants gained more rights. Lords lost control. Cash economies weakened the hold of in-kind taxation. By the 16th century, in many places, private ovens were tolerated or at least overlooked. The steward became less a threat and more a nuisance. Bread became freer. But the memory remained. Stories passed down spoke of secret ovens, narrow escapes, and stewards with smoke-colored robes. In one tale, a woman bakes an entire feast in a hole in the woods, feeding the village during a blizzard. The steward tries to fine her, but falls into a pit of yeast. Moral unclear, possibly symbolic. In retrospect, the system seems absurd. Taxing the act of baking, controlling the heat of survival. Yet it made sense within the logic of feudalism. Power was local. Ownership was vertical. Bread was everything. Controlling it meant control. And so, for generation after generation, villagers baked their loaves under the eye of authority. They paid their dues, they burned their fingers, they muttered about the steward, but still they lined up, week after week, dough in hand, hearts heavy, hoping the crust would rise, but not too much, lest someone start asking questions. Manorial life did not revolve around bread alone, but bread had a peculiar way of revealing everything. To understand how deep the control of landlords ran in the medieval countryside, one must look beyond the ovens and into the structure that bound peasants to the land like vines around old timber. This was the world of feudal tenancy, where rights were privileges and responsibilities were obligations wrapped in Latin clauses and vague threats. Most peasants did not own the land they lived on. They rented it from the lord of the manor, whose holdings were often granted by the king or inherited from generations of well-placed ancestors. Rent was paid in labor, in crops, in animals, and occasionally in outright coin if the manor had made the jump to a partial cash economy. But the relationship between peasant and landlord was not merely economic. It was social, legal, and deeply personal. The steward knew who had patched their roof, who had borrowed a mule, and who had spoken ill of the oven fire last Thursday. He kept records, he kept notes, he kept score. Tenancy agreements varied widely. Some peasants were villains, bound to the manor and unable to leave without permission. Others were freemen, technically mobile but still obligated to certain customs. A few were kotars or bordars, terms that denoted how much land they held and how many goats they could reasonably be expected to contribute in an emergency. The specifics were complex, but the common thread was this: the land did not belong to them, and neither did the decisions. The rules governing their tenancy were a patchwork of custom and decree. In many manors, failure to fulfill obligations could result in removal. A missed harvest delivery, a skipped church attendance, or, yes, unauthorized baking could trigger warnings. Repeated offenses might lead to fines. Beyond that, eviction. And in a world where shelter was the difference between survival and starvation, eviction was no small punishment. A recorded case from an English manor in the early 1300s details the removal of a family for failing to use the lord's mill. They had taken their grain 2 miles away to a competing estate's mill, seeking better rates. The steward, upon learning this, cited them for disruption of the customary flow of grain and seized their cottage. The family left with 2 sacks of barley and a wooden stool. Their goose was confiscated as penalty. The reasoning was always cloaked in language that implied harmony. Landlords maintained that the shared infrastructure of the manor, the oven, the mill, the press, was a collective good. Using it ensured uniformity. Protecting it preserved order. But beneath these noble intentions lurked a simple reality. These were monopolies. The lord charged for access to essential services and penalized any attempt to opt out. The oven was not just an appliance, it was a mechanism of compliance. Some landlords took this logic further. They established mandatory baking days during which all villagers were expected to bring their dough to the communal oven. Non-compliance was noted. A man who failed to appear with his loaves might be accused of hiding flour. A woman who skipped her slot might be suspected of planning an illicit bake. The oven became not just a tool, but a schedule, a test, a trap. Landlords relied on stewards, reeves, and bailiffs to enforce these norms. The reeve, often a peasant himself, was responsible for maintaining local order and reporting violations. This placed him in a precarious position, half trusted, half resented. He might be your neighbor, your cousin, or the man who once borrowed your ladder and never returned it. Now he was watching your chimney for signs of unauthorized smoke. Eviction itself was not a clean process. It began with a summons. The peasant would be brought before the manor court, a small assembly of local men overseen by the steward. There, the charges would be read. Sometimes they were laughably precise. Baking of 5 barley loaves outside approved fire, or willful heating of stones without consent. Sometimes they were vague. disturbance of custom, or failure to uphold duties of tenancy. The punishment depended on mood, precedent, and politics. A well-liked tenant might be let off with a fine. A repeat offender, especially one who questioned the logic of the rules, might be expelled. The court would record the judgment, and the family would have a day, maybe two, to vacate. Their cottage, technically part of the manor, reverted to the landlord. Any repairs made by the tenant were considered gifts to the estate. Peasants had little recourse. Appeal to higher courts was rare and costly. Defying the order could result in forced removal. Violence was discouraged but not unheard of. In one surviving account, a steward in Normandy had to be restrained from dragging a flour sack out of a woman's arms mid-eviction. The sack split open. The flour was ruined. The steward fined her for wasting grain. Not all lords were cruel. Some viewed evictions as last resorts. They preferred to keep tenants in place, productive, fearful, and dependent. A well-managed manor avoided open conflict. But even the gentlest landlord understood the power of potential eviction. The knowledge that shelter could be taken away with a word was often more effective than any sword. For many peasants, the threat loomed quietly. They followed the rules even when they seemed absurd. They paid their oven dues, they baked on time, they avoided questions. And when they grumbled, they did so privately, in corners, in whispers, behind hands. A loaf could rise too much, a steward could overhear. And no one wanted to be packing their belongings before Michaelmas with nowhere to go. The relationship was a performance. The peasant pretended loyalty, the lord pretended fairness, the steward pretended neutrality. And the oven, squat and silent, smoked in the background, the truest symbol of the system: use it or lose everything. This social architecture extended into every area of life: the field one worked, the firewood one gathered, even the pond where one fished. All were governed by rules, many of them unwritten. Customary law had teeth. Breaking it might not result in jail, but it could mean exile. And in a society where mobility was rare, being cast out was not just inconvenient, it was life-altering. Some peasants tried to navigate the system with cleverness. They bartered favors, they built alliances. They baked visibly and blandly, then cooked their seasoned loaves over coals in secret. They disguised roasted dough as vegetables. One man claimed he was drying mushrooms when questioned about the smell of crust. The steward did not believe him. He was fined and warned. The mushrooms, tragically, were real. Historians still debate how widespread such enforcement was. Some manors operated with a lighter touch, focusing on tithes and labor rather than culinary compliance. Others, particularly in more densely populated or economically vital regions, enforced every rule with precision. It often came down to personality. A lenient steward might allow a quiet bake in winter. A vindictive one might watch chimneys after sunset and carry a ledger with an iron clasp. The anxiety was baked in, pun not entirely avoidable. Bread was nourishment, but it was also exposure. Every step in the process, from grain to crust, was visible, regulated, and weighed. It was hard to hide a bake. Harder still to prove one had not baked when the crust was warm and the smell lingered in the air. Thus the oven was not merely a utility. It was a checkpoint, a statement, a fire-lit boundary between what was tolerated and what was not. To cross it without permission was to declare independence, and the system, in all its smoky inertia, did not forgive independence easily. The communal oven was not the only corner of the manor where authority baked itself into daily life. In truth, the entire bread-making process, from grain to loaf, operated under a tightly controlled circuit of dependency. If a villager wished to bake, they first needed grain. To grind the grain, they needed access to the Lord's mill, and if they wished to consume anything resembling beer alongside their bread, they required permission to use the manorial malt house or pay a fee for brewing rights. It was an economy stitched together by obligations disguised as customs, and each step came with its own risks, rules, and rent. The local mill, often positioned near a stream or modest river, was one of the most visible expressions of manorial power. Peasants could not legally grind their grain elsewhere. Bringing it to a neighboring mill, even one owned by a cousin or fellow villager, was considered a breach of trust and sometimes even a legal offence. This rule ensured not only a steady income for the lord, but also surveillance. Millers were tasked not just with grinding, but with recording who brought what, when, and how much. These records served as both economic ledgers and social barometers. A family that brought more grain than usual might be hoarding. A family that brought none might be struggling or hiding. Millers, like stewards, walked a fine line between serving the manor and surviving its scrutiny. They were often viewed with suspicion by peasants. It was not entirely unjustified. The practice of tolling, taking a portion of the flour as payment, was ripe for abuse. A dishonest miller could easily skim a little extra from every sack. The lord rarely intervened unless the skimming interfered with his share. One peasant complaint, preserved in a manor roll, accuses the miller of flour whispers, an oddly poetic term describing the act of flicking flour off the weighing stone when no one was looking. Another complaint describes a miller who stored excess toll in a hollowed bench. When discovered, he claimed it was for mice. The steward fined the mice. After the grain was ground, it still needed to be transformed into dough. This, too, was subject to scrutiny. In certain manors, specific types of flour were regulated. White flour, seen as more refined, was reserved for the household of the lord, the church, and the infirm. Peasants were expected to bake with coarser meal, often a mix of barley, rye, or whatever had survived the weather and the rats. Once dough was prepared, beer often followed. Bread and ale were constant companions in the medieval diet, and brewing, like baking, required permission. In some manors, each household was allowed to brew once per season. Others allowed brewing only on feast days or only under supervision. The process involved boiling grains, adding herbs or hops, and storing the liquid in wooden casks. Like flour, beer was taxed. A portion was reserved for the lord's table and another for the steward's tasting, a role which several stewards took to with enthusiastic frequency. There were punishments for brewing too much, brewing too strong, or failing to pay the ale tax. In one recorded incident, a widow was fined for selling ale during a saint's feast without proper blessing or license. Her punishment included a day of public shaming, standing beside the manor oven holding a wooden spoon labelled "brew thief." No one was quite sure if it was the brewing or the selling that had offended the steward. Possibly both, possibly neither. These overlapping systems of control, mill, malt, oven, created a web from which few could escape. To live on the manor was to live within a chain of dependencies that wrapped around every calorie, and the penalties for breaking those chains, even accidentally, were both financial and social. A fine was one thing, a reputation was another. Gossip, after all, was the true currency of many medieval villages. If a man was seen carrying an unusually light sack to the mill, others noticed. If a woman's loaves rose too quickly, suspicions formed. If a family brewed too often, neighbors wondered aloud. Sometimes the gossip was accurate, sometimes it was not, but the steward listened to both. Some peasants attempted to navigate this web with tact. They paid early. They brought the steward small gifts, turnips, wax, the occasional songbird in a cage. Others leaned into piety, hoping that appearing devout would shield them from suspicion. The village church offered a second layer of surveillance. Priests often knew more about baking habits than theology. A confession could include theft, adultery, or unauthorized sourdough. The punishment for the latter was often lighter, but the shame lingered. Historians still debate how much resistance existed beneath the surface. While open revolt was rare, subtle rebellion thrived. Families developed methods of baking that left little evidence: loaves flattened and folded like cloth, bread steamed in cauldrons rather than baked. Some peasants soaked old crusts and reformed them into new loaves to avoid accusations of fresh baking. It was not appetizing, but it was technically legal. One account from a Flemish village describes a man who developed a technique of sun-drying dough on large rocks. The bread was leathery and unpleasant, but edible. When questioned, he claimed it was accidental laundry. The steward, finding no precedent for punishment, allowed it with a warning: "Do not let your shirts rise again." Even inside this tightly regulated system, strange exceptions appeared. Certain holidays allowed temporary freedom. Midsummer bakes, harvest feasts, and saints' vigils often came with suspensions of baking rules. On these days, villagers baked openly, shared loaves, and consumed both bread and beer without measuring. It was a brief window of liberation before the steward's ledger resumed its quiet tallying. The connection between grain, power, and punishment is hard to overstate. Bread was not just food. It was hierarchy. It was documentation. It was ritual. The oven recorded obedience. The mill recorded yield. The malt house recorded pleasure. Every bite was watched. Every crumb noted. And yet, through this gauntlet of surveillance, life persisted. Peasants baked with care, not just for fear of eviction, but because bread was home. The smell of rising dough, the feel of flour between fingers, the soft sound of crust cracking, it all formed the rhythm of survival. Stewards could weigh, inspect, and fine, but they could not erase the warmth of a good bake, shared in quiet defiance of a world that watched far too closely. So the circuit continued, grain to mill, dough to oven, brew to cup, rules etched into every step. Yet somewhere in between, amid the soot and suspicion, the villagers found small ways to stretch their freedom. A loaf shared in secret. A jug passed quietly. A crust burned on purpose to hide the quality within. These moments did not overturn the system, but they softened it just enough. The world of medieval bread was not limited to rules about where peasants could bake. It extended to the strange, sometimes absurd, and always meticulously enforced list of ways that a villager could get into trouble. The fine system, long before modern bureaucracy, managed to capture the essence of both punishment and paperwork with the precision of a tax collector and the creativity of a bored playwright. There were fines for failing to use the oven, yes, but there were also fines for flour weights, for crust coloration, for bread deemed suspiciously festive, and for loaf shapes considered morally ambiguous. Enforcement of these fines depended on local custom and the temperament of the steward, but manor rolls from across Europe show that violations were surprisingly common and that no village was immune from the consequences. In one English manor, a baker was fined 3 pence for using the lord's wood to stoke an unauthorized fire, even though the wood in question was a pile of damp branches he had gathered himself. In another village, a woman was charged with reckless milling after she attempted to grind grain at home using a heavy stone and a method passed down from her grandmother. The steward described her technique as primitive and subversive. Stewards kept records with remarkable detail. Each entry was logged by date, by offender, by offence, and by outcome. These records served not only as a legal archive, but as a quiet form of intimidation. Villagers knew that once a name appeared in the ledger, it would not be easily forgotten. A repeat offender might be watched more closely, subjected to unannounced inspections, or held up as an example during manor court. The ledgers, when viewed across seasons and years, revealed patterns, which households pushed boundaries, which families tended to pay without complaint, and which neighbours were prone to accusations. Manor courts met at irregular intervals, often under a tree or in a barn, attended by the steward, a few local jurors, and sometimes the reeve. Villagers brought grievances the steward read from the ledger. Fines were confirmed, reduced, or in rare cases waived, but most often they were enforced with a flat, unchanging seriousness that made the absurdity of the charges all the more painful. Some lords believed that fines should be instructive. Rather than simple payments, they introduced corrective duties. One man was ordered to spend a day assisting the firekeeper after attempting to disguise an illicit bake as an animal feed experiment. A woman was required to gather firewood for a week after she baked in her neighbour's hearth and blamed it on a visiting relative. The goal, according to the court, was moral realignment through exposure. There were also symbolic punishments. In certain places, a peasant caught baking outside the communal oven might be made to carry a loaf-shaped stone through the village. Others were required to kneel before the oven and confess their error. These acts were designed not just to correct behavior, but to reinforce the communal sense that rules mattered, that authority saw everything, and that even bread could be sacred if enough people agreed to pretend. Not all villagers accepted these fines quietly. Resistance came in many forms, some bold, most subtle. Families might bake secretly at night, wrapping dough in leaves and placing it among embers, disguised as household warmth. Others delayed baking until feast days when enforcement was lax. A few shared their fines among extended relatives, pretending the bread was for cousins or elderly parents who could not reach the oven. In such cases, the punishment might fall on the entire household, especially if the steward suspected collusion. Bread itself became a tool of deception. Some peasants learned to underbake, then finished the loaf at home over a small fire, claiming it had needed drying rather than baking. Others developed folding techniques that disguised the texture, making stale bread appear fresh and fresh bread seem reused. Crusts were sometimes scraped with blades to reduce their appearance of authenticity, and flour was mixed with ash or herbs to alter the smell, masking signs of illicit baking. The reeve, often caught between loyalty to the manor and sympathy for the villagers, played a complicated role. Some reeves took their duties seriously, documenting every rumour and reporting every oven. Others looked the other way, choosing peace over precision. Still others became enforcers in their own right, conducting spot checks and making private deals to reduce fines in exchange for favours or goods. Their influence varied wildly, but they remained central figures in the landscape of fines, enforcement, and forgiveness. Historians debate whether this level of surveillance and control was consistent across all regions. Some argue that in remote villages, especially those far from the main manor house, enforcement slackened. Others suggest that in times of economic hardship, lords relied more heavily on fines to generate revenue, pushing stewards to find infractions wherever possible. There are manor rolls that show spikes in fines during bad harvests, indicating that as peasants struggled to eat, landlords struggled to maintain profits. Beyond the village, the church sometimes played a role in enforcement. Though it did not oversee manorial ovens directly, it often reinforced the moral framework used to justify the fines. Priests preached about obedience, order, and the importance of communal living. Disobedient baking was framed not only as a legal offense but as a spiritual failing, an act of pride or rebellion that threatened the harmony of the community. Feast days offered temporary reprieve. On certain holy days, the rules were relaxed, either formally or informally. Villagers could bake at home, provided the bread was shared during the celebration. These moments of sanctioned freedom were cherished. Families planned weeks in advance, preparing special recipes, setting aside ingredients, and inviting neighbors to join in the indulgence. For a brief time, the steward's authority was quieted, and bread became joy rather than burden. In these windows of celebration, new breads emerged. Spiced loaves, honeyed rolls, and layered flatbreads appeared on tables. Children carried small twists of dough baked into animal shapes. Elders told stories of ancestors who had once faced similar finds but had outwitted the steward with clever disguises. These stories, passed down over generations, became a form of oral resistance, a quiet assurance that, while the system endured, so did the creativity of those who lived under it. Still, once the feast ended, the oven returned to its central place. The rules resumed, the fines reappeared, and the peasants, wiser but wearier, returned to the long line outside the stone dome, clutching their dough and avoiding eye contact with the steward. Some tried petitions. A group of villagers from one manor presented a formal request for reduced oven fees, citing the age of the structure, the inconsistency of the firekeeper, and the risk of overcrowding. The steward noted their arguments, thanked them for their initiative, and doubled the inspection schedule. The fees remained unchanged. Others sought external help. A travelling monk, sympathetic to their cause, attempted to advocate for communal baking rights during a sermon. He was banned from the manor, and his sermon was later reported to the bishop as theological misdirection. Peasants who had attended were reminded one by one that loyalty to the manor was not optional, and that any future complaints should be addressed through proper channels. None of these strategies led to lasting change. The oven remained the oven. The steward remained the steward. But the efforts themselves spoke volumes. They revealed a population that understood the weight of its situation and refused to accept it entirely. They revealed a quiet rebellion, a refusal to surrender every loaf to the ledger. And sometimes, very rarely, the system slipped. A steward retired, a new lord took over, a war drew attention elsewhere. In those gaps, for a week or a month, villagers baked freely. They did not announce it, they did not record it, but they remembered. One record, scribbled in the margin of a church ledger, notes simply, "The month of free baking." No fines are listed, no punishments, just a break in the system, brief and silent. In the great ledger of history, most entries are ordinary, a name, a date, a payment. But occasionally there is something more. A fine challenged, a loaf shared, a fire lit without permission. These are the stories worth remembering, because in the end, the oven was not just a place of heat, it was a monument to control. And the bread that came from it, whether burnt, bland, or beautiful, was more than food. It was a record of resistance, a crumb trail of humanity baked into the heart of power. For the medieval peasant, survival required more than endurance. It required creativity. And nowhere did that creativity manifest more vividly than in the quiet rebellion against oven fines. When baking rules grew too costly or too convoluted, villagers turned not to protest or petitions, but to innovation, and often a remarkable sense of humor. What emerged was a strange catalogue of evasive techniques, odd legal loopholes, and domestic mischief, all in the service of one goal: to bake without being caught. Some villagers constructed what later came to be known as false ovens. These were small clay domes hidden behind sheds, beneath piles of straw, or tucked inside lean-tos disguised as animal shelters. To the untrained eye, they were simple fire pits or old bread warmers. To the steward, they were contraband. Discovery meant immediate fines and, in some cases, destruction of the structure with a steward's walking stick. But until they were caught, these covert bakers enjoyed freedom from fees and often superior bread. One village developed a method of communal baking in the woods, far beyond the sightlines of the manor. A ring of stones formed a crude hearth. Villagers took turns hauling dough out under cover of darkness, often pretending they were gathering mushrooms or checking livestock. The bread produced in these moonlit ovens was dense and slightly smoky, but it was theirs, and it did not carry the scent of obligation. Other forms of evasion were more theatrical. There were cases of villagers disguising baked loaves as other items, flatbread passed off as blankets, rounded rolls hidden among cabbages, and in one particularly imaginative instance, a large barley loaf hollowed out and worn as a hat. The hat loaf unfortunately collapsed during a sudden rain, and the wearer was fined 2 pence for crust display unbecoming. One of the most common strategies was the accidental bake. A family might claim their dough had been placed too close to the hearth by mistake, or that a child, unaware of oven rules, had tucked it into a warm spot out of curiosity. The steward's reaction varied. Some accepted the excuse, particularly from well-behaved families. Others wrote the incident down as bread negligence and imposed a half fine. Such strategies required cooperation, and villages often developed unspoken codes to protect one another. If a steward arrived asking questions, neighbors might confirm alibis, claim shared dough, or feign ignorance about the scent of freshly baked rye in the air. Children were sometimes coached on what to say, and in more vigilant communities, elderly relatives acted as lookouts from porches and hillsides. In time, certain villages became known for their evasiveness. Manor rolls from one estate note that the people of Lower Parnell are clever in avoiding the oven, though we have fined them thrice this year. Another steward lamented that his jurisdiction included a village of liars and crust saboteurs. He later transferred to a less troublesome estate. Despite these efforts, many villagers still ended up fined. The rules were strict, and the enforcement was often motivated less by fairness than by the need to maintain control. But every time a peasant avoided the oven, even for a single bake, it felt like a small victory, a moment of agency in a world where nearly every other aspect of life was regulated. The creativity extended beyond baking. Villagers used similar strategies to avoid the mill, the press, and other manorial monopolies. Some ground grain between stones at home, claiming it was for feed. Others crushed apples by foot rather than use the cider press. In one manor, a group of villagers dug a hidden mill race and constructed a secret wheel that operated only at night. The wheel was discovered during a flood, and the culprits were fined a year's worth of tolls. Such resistance, while rarely coordinated, was persistent. It revealed a deep understanding among peasants of the rules that governed them, and the ways to bend those rules without openly breaking them. These were not revolts, they were acts of quiet resilience. Even language became a form of resistance. Villagers developed euphemisms and codes. To dry the loaves meant to bake at home. Checking the stew might mean retrieving hidden dough. Children played games called Find the Crust and Chase the Reeve, often watched with silent amusement by adults who knew the subtext. There were songs too. One English folk verse, preserved in a manuscript from the 14th century, includes the line, "Oven hot, but not for me. I bake beneath the elder tree." Another, sung in taverns, mocked the steward's inspections. "He weighs the bread, he sniffs the roll, but never finds my secret coal." Humour was a vital tool. It allowed villagers to cope with the absurdity of their restrictions, to make light of their fines, and to preserve dignity even when hauled before the manor court. Laughter was not recorded in the ledgers, but it echoed in the spaces between lines. Some landlords eventually attempted to respond to this wave of evasion. They expanded inspection powers, authorized surprise visits, or increased fines. One steward began offering rewards for tips, paying in bread credits. The policy backfired. Villagers fed him false leads, directing him toward innocent neighbors, while the real bakers operated freely elsewhere. At times, enforcement reached surreal levels. A steward in Burgundy reportedly hired a boy to sniff chimneys for unauthorized baking. The boy became something of a local celebrity, though his usefulness diminished after a dog bit him and he refused to continue. Another manor invested in an oven bell, which rang whenever it was opened, alerting the steward. It broke within a week. Despite the harshness of the system, it failed to suppress all defiance. What it did instead was create a culture of workarounds, of whispered advice, and inherited tricks. Baking became more than sustenance. It became a puzzle, a challenge to be solved anew with each batch. Villagers passed down more than recipes, they passed down strategies. Some of these tricks became legend. The triple crust method, designed to mask the rise pattern. The ash roll, baked directly in coals to confuse inspectors. The wind bake, done with heated stones and reflected sunlight, possibly mythical but often discussed. Children learned these alongside prayers. To outsiders it might have seemed petty. All this secrecy, this effort, this risk for a loaf of bread. But to those who lived under the system, the loaf represented more than calories. It represented a moment of freedom. A single decision that belonged to them and not to the steward's ledger. The oven, after all, was not just a firebox. It was a checkpoint, a place where the rules of ownership and obedience were physically enacted. By stepping outside that boundary, even briefly, a peasant could reclaim something essential, a quiet dignity untouched by fines or forms. These acts did not change the system, but they softened it. They allowed villagers to feel, however briefly, that their labor and knowledge had value apart from the manor's approval, that they could still shape their lives even if the shape was irregular and smelled faintly of ash. When viewed in full, these evasions form a kind of alternate history, a shadow system running parallel to the official one. In that shadow system, ovens were wherever heat could be found, fines were avoided, and crusts were not inspected but enjoyed. It was an imperfect, fragile, and profoundly human resistance, one that lived, quite literally, on bread alone. Every system of control eventually invites resistance, and in medieval villages resistance was almost never open. It did not come in the form of torches or protests. It came as a loaf baked after midnight, a quiet whistle from a child stationed at the edge of a field, a hollowed log used as a chimney to mask the smoke of an illicit bake. These acts were small, often invisible, but together they formed a silent current of defiance beneath the surface of the manorial world. Peasants were, above all, pragmatic. They knew the risks. They knew the power of the steward, the reeve, the ledger. But they also knew hunger, injustice, and the feel of flour under their nails. They knew that baking bread at home, in private, in silence, was faster, easier, and sometimes simply necessary. So they broke the rules carefully, quietly, and with a resilience that has outlived their names. Some of this resistance took the form of hidden ovens, as described earlier. But just as common were social strategies, non-violent, cunning, and remarkably coordinated. One of the most enduring forms was the use of lookout systems. When someone baked illegally, other villagers would stand watch. Children played games near paths and crossings, trained to shout about imaginary foxes or lost sheep if they saw the steward approaching. Elders leaned on walking sticks at crossroads, not because they needed to rest, but because they wanted to see who was coming and where they were headed. Information moved quickly. A raised hand, a specific whistle, a cart parked at an odd angle. These were the tools of communication. There were no written codes, only practiced signals. And though stewards suspected such networks existed, they rarely had proof. Even when they did, they often lacked the resources to confront an entire village, acting in unspoken agreement. Sometimes resistance took more theatrical forms. In one recorded incident, a group of villagers in Yorkshire staged a mock feast using stones shaped like bread loaves. They invited the steward to inspect their bake, claimed innocence, and burst into laughter when he tried to confiscate a lump of granite. The steward fined them for mockery. The villagers paid with pennies collected in a shoe handed over by a goat. More often, though, resistance was practical. A peasant might pay the oven fee but bake only part of their dough, finishing the rest at home. Another might disguise baked loaves as uncooked ones, presenting them to the steward with flour sprinkled on top and a story about slow fermentation. Some villagers baked just enough to avoid suspicion, then bartered secretly for additional bread with neighbors who had larger families and could pass off extra loaves as their own. The barter system became a quiet rebellion of its own. Bread moved from household to household, not for coin, but for favors, labor, or goods. A loaf might buy an afternoon of fence repair, a jug of ale, or a week of kindling. These exchanges were rarely documented, making them invisible to manorial oversight. In some manors, the steward attempted to regulate such bartering. Notices were posted, written or spoken, declaring that all baked goods must be accounted for. The villagers listened politely and ignored the instruction. Despite their efforts, stewards could not be everywhere. They had other duties: fields to inspect, harvests to record, disputes to settle. Bread inspections for all their drama were intermittent, and even when they occurred, they often relied on circumstantial evidence. A steward might knock on a door and ask to see the contents of an oven. The family would offer ashes and excuses. Unless the bread was in hand or the smell was undeniable, the steward left with suspicions and little else. This ambiguity worked in the villagers' favor. It allowed for mistakes, improvisation, and plausible deniability. A family caught with a warm loaf might claim it had been gifted by a neighbor. A child, seen carrying a bundle, might insist it was laundry. These explanations, while not always believed, were difficult to disprove. And unless the steward was willing to search every cupboard and chase every child, enforcement remained partial at best. One of the most effective forms of resistance was simply pretending not to understand. Villagers would feign confusion over new regulations, claim ignorance of specific dates, or express disbelief that baking in a fire pit counted as oven use. In regions where dialects varied, language itself became a shield. A steward from one county might struggle to communicate clearly in another, and villagers exploited this by mispronouncing, misdirecting, or deliberately misunderstanding his instructions. There is a record of a steward from Devonshire who travelled to a border village and attempted to impose a fine for unauthorized use of the communal oven. The villagers insisted they had never heard of such a rule, and that their baking stones were older than the manor itself. The steward, frustrated, demanded to see the loaves. The villagers presented him with unleavened discs, scorched and hard, and claimed they were for roofing. The steward left, unconvinced but outnumbered. Sometimes resistance came not from peasants, but from within the system. A sympathetic reeve might overlook minor violations. A tired steward might ignore one suspicious loaf to avoid an argument. In a few cases, lords themselves turned a blind eye, preferring peace to strict adherence. These moments of leniency were rare, but remembered. They gave villagers hope, encouraged further subtlety, and reinforced the idea that the rules could bend. These forms of resistance did not exist in isolation. They were part of a broader pattern of adaptation. Just as peasants adjusted planting cycles to match the weather and used superstition to explain disease, they used quiet rebellion to navigate authority. They were not revolutionaries. They did not seek to overthrow the system. They sought to live within it, bending it just enough to survive with dignity. Over time, some of these strategies became tradition. Children were taught which fields made the best cover, which corners of the hearth retained heat, and how to tell the difference between a steward's footstep and a traveller's. Elders passed down stories of successful evasions, and every household had its own lore about flour, fire, and fines. This folklore included more than techniques. It included saints and superstitions. Some believed that Saint Honoratus, patron of bakers, would protect those who baked in secret if they offered him a pinch of salt. Others swore by specific herbs burned in the fire to disguise the smell of fresh crust. A few claimed that placing a broom across the threshold would confuse the steward and prevent his entry. Whether these beliefs had merit or not, they gave villagers a sense of control. Resistance also had emotional value. It bonded communities, created shared stories, and reminded peasants that they were not powerless. In a world defined by rigid hierarchy, these small acts were bursts of agency. They might not change the manor, but they changed the mood. A loaf baked in defiance tasted better. A joke whispered at the steward's expense lingered longer than the heat of the oven. Not every act of resistance succeeded. Some villagers were caught, fined, or punished. Yet even these failures became part of the communal memory. The man who hid bread in a haystack and forgot it for 3 days. The woman who tried to bake on a borrowed hearth and burned the thatch. The boy who confused ash for flour and ruined the dough. Their mistakes were retold, reshaped, and laughed over. Failure was not shameful, it was simply the cost of trying. And so, through watchfulness, cleverness, and community, the peasants persisted. They baked in secret, they shared in silence, they smiled when fined, and baked again. Each loaf was an act of labor, but also of quiet rebellion. Not because it would topple the system, but because it reminded them that they still had hands, and heat, and will. They could be watched, they could be fined, but they could also bake. The arrival of the steward for a bread inspection was never sudden, and yet it was always unwelcome. It began with a silence more deliberate than usual, as though the birds themselves knew to hush. Dogs, so often vocal in their daily complaints, slinked to corners. Doors creaked open with less confidence. Somewhere near the edge of the village, the reeve might already be walking ahead, nodding once or twice, not out of greeting, but as a signal. The steward was coming. Again. He did not arrive in haste. That was part of the theatre. He moved slowly, deliberately, allowing time for worry to ripple through the houses. On some days he carried only his ledger. On others he brought a small iron scale or a strip of measuring cord. It depended on his mood and on the purpose of the visit. Was it a general inspection, a follow-up, or something more targeted, perhaps the result of a whispered rumor passed in exchange for leniency? Villagers had little choice but to cooperate. Refusing to open one's door was not an option. Claiming illness might delay the inspection, but only temporarily, and often resulted in increased suspicion. The steward had legal authority, reinforced by the Lord's seal, and, if necessary, the presence of 2 strong-armed assistants who preferred not to be used, but rarely declined the opportunity. Bread inspections were not just a formality, they were an assertion of control. Every loaf examined, every crust measured was a reminder that the manor reached into the hearth, the home, the heart of daily life. It was not enough to work the fields or pay the rent. One's baking had to be visible, verifiable, and above all, properly sourced. The inspection began with questions. What grain had been used? When was it milled? Where was it stored? Who had prepared the dough? At what hour was it baked? These inquiries, harmless in tone, carried weight. Answers were cross-referenced with past records, statements from neighbors, or the steward's own memory, which was notoriously good. If a loaf was presented, the steward did not simply glance at it. He held it up to the light. He tapped it with his knuckle. He sniffed it, sometimes theatrically, as though scent alone could reveal criminal intent. The crust was examined for uniformity, the bottom for soot patterns, the surface for signs of glaze or added ingredients. It was said that some stewards could tell the difference between a lord's oven and a home fire simply by the curve of the bread's rise. Fines were issued immediately. They were written into the ledger, read aloud, and confirmed by witnesses. There was no appeal process beyond the manor court, and that court met infrequently. A peasant who objected too loudly risked a second fine, for disorder, for disrespect, or, in one case, for raising voice in the presence of sacred dough. The punishments varied. Most were monetary. A few involved additional labor, gathering wood for the manor oven, cleaning the flour storeroom, or assisting the firekeeper for a day. Occasionally, the punishment was symbolic, a public apology, a recitation of the oven regulations, or the forced consumption of one's own overbaked loaf in front of an amused crowd. Yet despite the spectacle, enforcement was not always thorough. Stewards were human. They tired, they erred. Some grew lazy in their roles, relying on threats more than action. Others, facing multiple villages under their charge, focused only on those most likely to resist. It was an imperfect system, but it functioned well enough to maintain fear. Villagers adapted. They learned which excuses worked best. A broken oven door at the manor could justify a delayed bake. A visiting priest could distract from an unexpected aroma. Children were sent outside during inspection hours with baskets full of misleading goods, roots, dried herbs, sometimes stones wrapped in cloth to resemble dough. One story tells of a woman who hid her bread in a basket of apples. When questioned, she claimed she had been preparing a gift for the steward's mother. Flattered, the steward allowed her to pass. Whether his mother ever received the apples, no one knew. Other villagers were more direct. They paid the fine without complaint, not because they accepted the rule, but because the price was worth the silence that followed. Bread, after all, was more than food. It was warmth, routine, comfort. Paying to preserve that peace was, for some, a trade they were willing to make. Still, patterns emerged. Households fined repeatedly were watched more closely. Those who baked irregularly or produced loaves too fine for their apparent means were questioned more often. A family whose bread was too pale one week and too dark the next might be suspected of alternating between legal and illegal ovens. The steward noticed these things. Sometimes he acted on them. Other times he waited. Allowing suspicion to grow was a tactic. A delayed inspection could increase fear. And fear, as the steward knew well, was the best way to ensure cooperation. Bread became more than sustenance. It became a record. Its shape, color, texture all told a story. A crust too thick might suggest old flour. A crumb too moist, recent rain. A scent too strong, the addition of unauthorized herbs. Each loaf was a confession, each inspection a reading. In this environment, honesty was not always the safest path. Villagers lied. They did so gently, with practiced ease. They claimed to have baked at the manor oven on days it was closed. They described ingredients they had not used. They invented relatives who had borrowed their dough or neighbors who had delivered the finished loaf. These lies were not malicious. They were necessary. In a world where fire itself was regulated, the truth could be dangerous. Children learned the rules early. They watched their parents prepare dough, not with joy, but with caution. They memorized phrases, alibis, routes for fleeing if the steward arrived early. Games were played in which one child acted as steward, another as the baker, the rest as witnesses. It was pretend but not fantasy. It was practice. The oven itself, when finally visited, was treated with mixed emotions. Some saw it as a burden, others as a center of life. Most simply accepted it. Its walls were thick, its smoke predictable. It did not judge. Only the steward did that. There were, however, brief moments of relief. Feast days, weddings, seasonal festivals. During these times, regulations softened. Bread flowed more freely. Inspections paused. The steward, often invited to participate, did not carry his ledger. He drank, ate, laughed, and for a day or two the village exhaled. But the ledger always reopened. the stick returned, the silence returned, and the villagers once more measured flour with precision, watched chimneys for excess smoke, and listened for the sound of approaching boots. Some say the steward enjoyed his work, others say he envied the villagers. After all, he could inspect bread, but he rarely baked it. He could issue fines, but he never truly tasted the crust. His role was to observe, to regulate, to enforce. And that role, however powerful, was a lonely one. He left each house with notes. He left behind worry, but he also left behind stories, tales of mistaken flour, of hidden loaves, of brave denials. These stories passed from mouth to ear, grew in the telling. They became legends, and so bread continued to rise in secret. Fires burned low and fast, ashes were swept with haste, and villagers, hearts pounding, broke their loaves with hands still dusted in fear. The steward walked on, ledger in hand. The village watched him go. It was during the hardest years, the ones marked by famine, plague, or unrelenting storms, that the bread rules were both most rigid and most fragile. Crisis altered everything. The manorial oven, already a symbol of control, became a crucible of scarcity, suspicion, and social strain. Peasants, who had once accepted the oven's monopoly as burdensome but stable, now found themselves caught in a tightening vice. The same rules remained, but the stakes changed. What had once cost a fine now risked a life. The Black Death reshaped villages long before it emptied them. When illness spread and fields went untended, when markets closed and mills fell silent, the communal rhythms of bread-making disintegrated. Yet the need for bread did not disappear. In fact, it intensified. With fewer mouths to feed but even fewer hands to bake, each loaf gained weight, socially, spiritually, practically. Some manors attempted to maintain the old rules. The steward, perhaps out of habit or pride, continued his inspections. Fines were still issued, bread was still confiscated, but the social calculus shifted. What had once been a fear of punishment became a question of survival. If a family could not bake at home, they might not bake at all. If they could not bake, they could not eat. And so many baked in silence and hoped the steward had more pressing matters to attend to. Often he did. The stewards themselves were not immune to the changing times. Some died, others fled. A few simply gave up enforcement, whether from exhaustion or sympathy. One record describes a steward who, after losing his own family to illness, declared, "Let them bake where they will." He was dismissed a month later. The villagers held a small vigil and, in defiance of custom, baked a dozen loaves in his honor, distributing them freely without fear. But other stewards doubled down. In an effort to maintain order or to reassert authority in a crumbling world, they increased inspections. New fees were imposed, sometimes not for baking at home, but for failing to bake often enough. The rationale was unclear. Perhaps it was an attempt to measure food reserves or simply to extract what little remained from tenants already at their limits. During these years, communal ovens sometimes fell into disrepair. With fewer people to use and maintain them, the structures cracked, the firestones wore thin, and the smoke holes clogged. In one village, the oven collapsed entirely during a festival. The manor blamed the villagers for overloading it with dough. The villagers blamed the steward for neglecting repairs. No one was fined, but the oven was not rebuilt. Instead, villagers returned to older methods: clay pots, flat stones, heated tiles. These were ancient techniques passed down from times before manorial law. They were inefficient, but they worked, and more importantly, they required no permission. Famine added another layer of complexity. In years of poor harvest, the bread itself changed. Wheat disappeared first, then rye. Barley became the standard. Eventually, flour gave way to mixtures of husk, acorn, root, and, in some cases, dried nettles or bark. These loaves were dense, bitter, and barely edible, but they were better than nothing. With each decline in quality, enforcement became more difficult. What exactly constituted a loaf when the ingredients varied so wildly? Could the steward fine someone for baking a round of boiled moss? In theory, yes. In practice, it became absurd, and yet some persisted. A steward in southern England reportedly carried a chart detailing acceptable crust colours based on grain content. Villagers mocked him by painting loaves with crushed berries to achieve forbidden hues. The steward responded by confiscating pigments. The villagers responded by adding soot. Churches, meanwhile, struggled with their own contradictions. They preached charity but often enforced the same manorial rules. The village priest might distribute alms one day and report unauthorized baking the next. Some clergy advocated for leniency. Others warned that unblessed bread, baked outside the communal order, invited divine wrath. One sermon declared, "The loaf made in darkness shall taste of ash and sin." A widow in the front row, known for her excellent crusts, laughed aloud. She was not fined, but she was not invited back. Despite the tensions, these crises also fostered solidarity. Villagers shared ovens when they could, loaned flour in exchange for crusts, and developed informal rotations. Children were tasked with watching fires, not just for safety, but to ensure that no one's baking drew unwanted attention. Old women, once sidelined, became essential as repositories of pre-manorial baking knowledge. Their methods, dismissed for decades, returned in force. In these kitchens, if one could call a circle of stones and a pile of damp kindling a kitchen, new rituals formed. Bread was scored with symbols, not for decoration, but as a kind of blessing. Loaves were placed near thresholds to ward off illness. A piece of dough was set aside each time, buried or burned, as an offering to saints or spirits. The line between cooking and magic blurred, as it often did when the world turned uncertain. These practices were rarely acknowledged in manor records, but they lived in the margins, in sudden drops in fines, in unexplained absences of the steward, in vague notes about seasonal baking disturbances. There is one surviving entry from 1350 written in a hurried hand which reads, "Loaves observed in the woods, suspect none." Whether it was a moment of mercy or a mistake remains unknown. As the worst years passed and populations slowly recovered, the manorial system attempted to reassert itself. Ovens were repaired, rules were reissued, fines resumed, but something had changed. The villagers had learned that they could survive without permission, that bread did not burn more easily outside the manor, that flour, when mixed with patience and cooperation, rose just as well in secrecy. Some lords recognized this shift and adapted. They relaxed enforcement, reduced fees, or allowed home baking under specific conditions. Others resisted. They insisted on returning to the old ways, even as their tenants grew fewer and less compliant. In one village, the steward attempted to rebuild the oven using new materials and more restrictive rules. The villagers refused to use it. He fined them. They paid, then baked again at home. The fines increased. Eventually, the oven sat cold, untouched. It became a storage shed. Years later, it was pulled down and the stones used to build a wall. Not all resistance was so visible. In most places, the rules returned, but so did the evasions. The dance resumed, more cautious perhaps, but unchanged in essence. The legacy of those years remained. Children who had seen their parents bake in silence grew into adults who remembered why. They taught their own children the old methods, not just for convenience, but as inheritance. Stories were told, not of rebellion, but of resilience, of nights when the fire was low and yet a crust formed, of mornings when the smell of bread meant life, not law. These stories did not appear in court rolls or manor records. They were passed in kitchens, at firesides, during the kneading of dough. They formed a quiet canon of resistance, a history of crusts and crumbs and survival. In time, some of the old laws faded. Ovens were less closely monitored. Fees were replaced with broader rents. The rise of towns, trade, and tenant farming shifted the balance of power. But even then, in the changing world, the memory of restriction lingered. A man might build a new oven and still recall the day his father hid dough in a cauldron. A woman might bake openly and remember the taste of root bread shared in fear. The past, shaped in fire and ash, did not disappear. It was baked in. In the world of manorial regulations, the rules may have been written by men, but it was often women who bore their weight. Nowhere was this more evident than in the daily act of baking bread. While village charters, court rolls, and manor ledgers tended to feature the names of husbands, stewards, and reeves, it was the hands of women that shaped the dough, timed the rise, tended the fire, and kept the rhythm of the kitchen. These acts, invisible to legal records but central to survival, unfolded every day beneath low thatched ceilings with sleeves rolled up and futures pressed into flour. Bread making began early, often before the sky had shifted from black to grey. A woman might begin with little more than a bowl, a pile of flour, and a knowledge passed down by repetition rather than writing. If the household was fortunate, the flour had come from the manorial mill. If not, it might have been ground by hand with a stone, slowly, painfully. The grindstone left calluses. The flour clung to the skin, and the first decision of the day loomed, whether to bake with permission or without it. This decision was not made lightly. Women understood the consequences. Fines were real. So was shame. If the steward suspected illicit baking, he might arrive unannounced. He might knock on the door while the loaf was cooling. He might question the children, search the hearth, or inspect the ashes. And it was the woman who would be expected to answer. Yet many chose to bake anyway. Not out of rebellion, but because they had mouths to feed and not enough coin to pay the oven toll. Or because the manorial oven was in disrepair again. Or because the steward's schedule was predictable that week and the neighbour's boy had agreed to keep watch. The reasons varied, the act remained the same. In the privacy of their homes, women became artists of evasion. They learned to knead silently, to shape dough without chatter. They developed techniques for disguising crusts, cooling loaves rapidly, or storing bread in hollowed benches and lidded baskets. If questioned, they had practiced answers. It was given to us, or we have not baked this week, or it is barley porridge left too long near the fire. Most stewards knew these excuses. Some chose to believe them, others fined anyway. The steward's gaze was not the only one to navigate. Other women watched too. Competition, friendship, envy, these all shaped village dynamics. An unusually fine loaf might stir whispers. A kitchen that smelled too fragrant might attract attention. Some neighbours turned informant, others shielded one another. Solidarity and suspicion coexisted in every lane. In some villages, women formed quiet networks. They shared firewood, kept track of the steward's movements, and watched one another's doors during baking days. A woman with a good fire might allow others to use it after dark. Another might offer flour in exchange for future loaves. These exchanges were not written, but they were remembered. A crust shared today earned protection tomorrow. One woman might excel at shaping dough. Another might know how to keep embers just hot enough for flatbread. A third might be able to disguise a loaf so thoroughly that even the reeve would mistake it for a pillow. These talents were passed through generations, not as rebellion, but as necessity. To know how to bake without being seen was to know how to feed one's family during lean times. The role of women in baking extended beyond survival. It became identity. A good baker was praised. Her bread might be requested at feast days, traded for ale, or used to settle small debts. A poor baker, by contrast, risked more than ridicule. If her loaves were undercooked, she might be accused of laziness. If they were too perfect, she might be suspected of cheating the system. Sometimes these suspicions reached the manor court. Accusations were rarely formal. Instead, they arrived through gossip, which the steward treated as currency. Her bread is always warm, someone might say, or she has no flour on record and yet her children are fed. Steward investigated. The woman answered. Sometimes it ended with a fine, sometimes with silence. Manor rolls occasionally include her name. Mildred, wife of Thomas, presented for baking on St. Peter's Eve. Agnes, known for fine crust, denied baking without toll. These entries are brief, but they point to a broader truth. Women were visible when they were in trouble. The rest of the time they were assumed. Yet there were moments when they pushed back. One woman, accused of baking 3 loaves without permission, brought them to court and cut them open before the steward, demonstrating their poor quality. "No one would fine me for these," she said. The fine was halved. Another refused to answer the steward's questions, stating that her oven had collapsed and that he was welcome to inspect the rubble. He did. She had built a new oven 3 feet away, under a lean-to. The steward fined her anyway. She paid and continued to bake. The legal system allowed for few victories, but women found ways to assert themselves. They delayed, negotiated, pleaded illness, blamed servants, or claimed miscommunication. Some succeeded, others were fined repeatedly. Their husbands sometimes intervened, sometimes they did not. A few men took over baking in times of trouble. Illness, pregnancy, or loss might bring a husband to the fire. These loaves were rarely good, but they were sufficient, and they too attracted attention. A steward noticing poor crust might ask, "Who baked this?" The man would answer, and the steward might smile. "Then your wife is free from blame today." Despite the risks, most women continued to bake regularly. The oven, after all, was not just a place of labor, it was a place of memory. Loaves were marked with symbols, simple lines, crosses, patterns of dots. These marks identified whose loaf was whose, but they also carried deeper meaning. A line for a child's birthday, a cross for a sick parent, a star for the harvest moon. These signs were scratched in quickly, but they mattered. On feast days, baking became a communal event. Women gathered near the manor oven, laughing, singing, sharing dough. The steward often attended, more to show presence than to enforce rules. On these days, fines were rare. Bread flowed freely, loaves were gifted, blessed, sliced in public. Even those who had paid fines earlier that month were allowed to join. But once the festival ended, the rules returned. The oven returned to its toll. The steward resumed his rounds, and the women resumed their careful routines. Their work was never mentioned in sermons. Their skills were not recorded in manorial reports, but without them the village would have gone hungry. Without them there would have been no bread to inspect, to fine, to confiscate. Their labor supported the very structure that limited their freedom. Historians now recognize this imbalance. While records focus on legal authority, it was women who kept the kitchen alive. Their flour-dusted hands held the knowledge of generations. Their quiet persistence kept the village fed. And though the steward may have written their names when things went wrong, the memory of their work lingers in the stories told later by grandchildren, by neighbors, by the women who followed them. They baked, under rules, under watch, under pressure. But still, they baked. In the narrow alleys between manorial walls and village homes, there existed another kind of regulation, unspoken and yet strictly enforced: social ritual. And among these rituals, none was more delicately negotiated nor more deeply ingrained than the rules surrounding waste, especially human waste. The medieval peasant's relationship with sanitation was a careful dance of practicality, superstition, and fear of manorial judgment. One did not simply relieve oneself and walk away from the consequences. There were expectations, codes, and, in some unfortunate cases, fines. It began, as many things did, with proximity. Manorial life was clustered, homes were built close together. Privies, where they existed, were rudimentary. Small wooden structures or shallow pits covered by wooden boards, usually located behind a dwelling or at the edge of a path. Some wealthier tenants built slightly elevated huts to allow waste to fall directly into a dug channel. Most made do with less. Nighttime presented particular challenges. Few dared venture beyond their doors after dark unless absolutely necessary. Some used chamber pots, others stepped outside and risked the cold. A few made use of garderobes, wooden seats over drains, though these were rare in village homes. The contents of chamber pots were emptied in the morning, usually at the back of the property. Ideally, one avoided emptying them near the manor's well or near the steward's path. The manor had opinions on this matter. Officially, waste was to be disposed of in designated ditches or away from water sources. Unofficially, enforcement varied. If the steward caught a tenant disposing of waste improperly, especially too near to the manor house or oven, he could issue a fine. Records include terms such as foul disposal, ditch misuse, and in one instance, night soil negligence. No one wished to see that phrase beside their name. These fines were usually small, but they carried a stain of public embarrassment. To be accused of poor sanitation was to be labelled unclean, disorderly, even disrespectful. The village, which tolerated many odd habits, had little patience for those who brought stench into shared spaces. It was not just about smell. Disease loomed over these habits. Though the villagers did not understand bacteria, they knew that foul air could sicken a household. They referred to bad humours, stinking vapours, and rotted air. Certain locations were avoided for this reason. A shaded corner that never dried might be called the fever nook. A patch of ground that smelled too often might earn a name no one dared say aloud near the stew pot. Superstition filled in the gaps. It was said that if one stepped over a waste ditch while speaking ill of a neighbour, one's tongue would swell. A child who played near a privy might bring bad dreams into the house. At least one tale suggested that the devil lived in the oldest pit, counting the droppings like coins. It was not a metaphor anyone wished to explain. Because of this, disposal was treated with discretion. Some families built screens from reeds or canvas, others waited until the fog rolled in. If it rained, villagers hurried to use the moment as cover, tipping buckets into streams swollen enough to carry the guilt away. These acts were not spoken of openly, but everyone understood. Manors with larger populations sometimes created communal latrines located near the edge of the estate. These were pits, perhaps with wooden planks, perhaps not, surrounded by hedges and a sense of collective dread. The steward might appoint a boy to inspect the area weekly. This job, often traded or avoided, involved little more than observation and a few vague notes in the margins of a ledger. Smell moderate. Pit nearing fullness. Pig seen near waste mound. Pigs, too, were part of the equation. In some places, swine were encouraged to forage near waste heaps. The pigs were efficient, if unhygienic, and stewards considered them useful. Villagers considered them ominous. A pig with a stained snout might be avoided for weeks. Children dared one another to touch such pigs, though few ever did. And yet the system functioned. People relieved themselves, avoided trouble, and moved on. Problems only arose when someone forgot their place in the sequence. If a pot was emptied at midday near a path, complaints followed. If someone relieved themselves too near the church, it became a matter of scandal. There is a note in one court roll regarding a man fined for disrespectful dunging, which the scribe underlined 3 times for emphasis. Public urination was tolerated barely. It depended on the time of day, the location, and the identity of the person. A child might be forgiven. An elder excused. A drunk, if he apologized, was usually spared. But a married man relieving himself near the manor's storage barn? That called for a response. The steward arrived with the reeve, made the man repeat his excuse, then ordered him to scrub the barn's lower planks with vinegar and a rag. Women faced different expectations. Discretion was required. A woman caught relieving herself outside was not just fined, she risked damage to her reputation. Whispers would follow. Her loaves might be avoided. Her children might be teased. One unfortunate woman, fined for broad squatting by hedge, was later blamed for a failed barley crop, though no one could quite explain the connection. To avoid this, women relied on quiet cooperation. If one needed relief during a long day in the fields, others stood watch. If at home, daughters or sisters might guard the door. Female solidarity extended into every uncomfortable corner of life. And still, mishaps occurred. A pot slipped, a privy collapsed. A child misunderstood where to dump the bucket. These were forgiven, if not repeated. If repeated, they earned a visit from the steward and a lecture about proper waste channels. Delivered with such gravity, it might as well have been scripture. Some manors developed more structured systems. Waste zones were marked with stakes or stones. Tenants were assigned days for cleaning shared areas. A few wealthier manors even employed a gong farmer, a man tasked with clearing and transporting night soil to fields or distant pits. Gong farmers were paid well and treated poorly. No one invited them for stew. But everyone understood their value. Their tools were distinctive: large wooden paddles, lined barrels, waxed boots. They worked at night, often in pairs, speaking in low tones and rarely making eye contact. Children feared them. Adults respected their silence. A clean pit, once emptied, seemed like a small miracle. The village smelled better. Sleep returned more easily. Over time, as village populations shifted and new customs emerged, some of these rules relaxed. But during the height of manorial regulation, waste management was a communal matter, tightly bound to reputation and rhythm. One did not just go where one pleased. One asked, one waited, one poured quietly, preferably with a witness nearby to confirm proper conduct, because in a world where bread could earn a fine, so too could the remnants of its digestion. Manners extended beyond the table. And even the most basic human needs passed through the filter of oversight. The steward, for all his focus on firewood and flour, made time for these matters. Not because he cared about cleanliness, though he often claimed he did, but because every rule upheld his authority. A bucket tipped too loudly, a pit left uncovered, a stench too persistent. These were reminders that the manor was always listening. And so the villagers adapted. They whispered reminders to children. They built fences taller, dug pits deeper, used leaves more cautiously. They did what was necessary with as much dignity as possible. The fields absorbed what they could, the streams carried what they must, and the people of the manor, ever watchful, ever wary, relieved themselves under the gaze of tradition and hurried back to their bread. Alongside bread and bodily rituals, there existed yet another domain in which the peasant's daily life intersected with manorial authority: the strange, slow economics of obligation. The manor was not merely a place of living and labouring, it was a place of owing. And what was owed varied wildly from season to season, from tenant to tenant, and often from one steward's imagination to another. A peasant might owe wheat in one month, hens in another, labour in one, and candles in the next. These expectations were not suggestions. They were baked into the legal soil of the estate, inherited like land, like weather, like fate. The term for this web of obligation was custom. It sounded benign, but for the peasant, custom meant calculation. It meant keeping track of not just what was grown or made, but what could be demanded. For one tenant, custom required 3 days of ploughing each spring. For another, it meant providing eggs every Monday during Lent. For a third, it involved standing watch near the dovecote once per month, holding a stick to scare off hawks. One could not simply live on manorial land, one lived under its ledger. Bread, naturally, played its part. In some places, a tenant was required to bake a loaf for the steward once per week using manor flour and firewood. In others, he owed not the loaf, but the raw dough to be assessed for quality. A few customs required the tenant to provide a specific kind of bread, coarse barley in winter, fine wheat on saints' days. If a loaf was deemed inadequate, it was not returned. It was recorded. The fine followed. These duties were known collectively as services, and they came in many forms: week work, boon work, tallage, merchet. Each had its own rules, and each was enforced by the manor court, which operated less like a court and more like a ledger with chairs. The steward called names, tenants responded, fines were read aloud. Everyone nodded because nodding was safer than questioning. These services were not negotiable, nor were they evenly applied. A man might owe 10 hours of hay cutting because his grandfather had once borrowed a sickle. A woman might owe 10 candles each year because her mother had once lit the Lord's corridor during a feast. The origin of the obligation mattered less than the fact of it. In theory, these customs were fixed. In practice, they drifted. A steward might increase expectations during a good harvest, or after a dispute, or simply because the Lord had taken a sudden interest in discipline. Villagers adapted as best they could. They bartered duties, they hired substitutes. A man too old to thresh might send his nephew. A widow unable to deliver eggs might offer a rabbit instead. These substitutions were accepted or rejected at the steward's discretion. Occasionally, a tenant refused, not loudly, just once, quietly. The steward recorded the refusal, assigned a fine, and waited. If the refusal continued, the case was brought before the court. Rarely did it go further. The threat of escalation was enough. Most tenants paid. Those who did not risked loss of land, tools, or status. Status was no small thing. Within the village, everyone knew who was free and who was bound. The free tenant paid rent, but owed little else. The villain paid less rent, but owed more labour. The cotter owed almost everything. And above them all sat the reeve, a peasant elevated by appointment, tasked with enforcing rules he had once endured. His allegiance belonged to both sides, and to neither. The reeve's role in obligations was vital. He monitored services, reported absences, confirmed deliveries. A good reeve kept the manor running. A cruel one made it suffer. A lazy one made it chaotic. The best reeves, according to village memory, were those who bent the rules without breaking them, who erased fines quietly, who swapped duties without documentation, who warned tenants before inspections. But not all reeves were kind. Some wielded their authority like a cudgel. They remembered every missed egg, every broken fence, every loaf slightly too hard. These reeves served the steward's interest. They rose quickly, they were not loved. Obligations extended beyond labour. Tenants owed hospitality. If a messenger from the Lord arrived, he expected food, drink, and a clean bed. If a hunting party passed through, the villagers were to assist with dogs, horses, and sometimes game preparation. A woman might be summoned to pluck fowl. A man might be asked to skin a boar. Refusal was recorded. Compliance was rarely thanked. There was also scutage, a payment in place of military service. Most peasants never saw war, but they helped fund it. During campaigns, obligations multiplied. Horses were seized, grain was requisitioned, bread was demanded for soldiers. The manor took what it needed and left receipts which were largely ceremonial. Recovery was rare. Some peasants tried to buy their freedom from obligations. This process, known as commutation, allowed a tenant to pay money instead of performing labor. Lords preferred it. Money was easier to store than barley, but not all tenants could afford it. And once a service was commuted, it could be reinstated. A new lord might reject the old agreement. A new steward might declare it invalid. The ledger remembered everything, the peasant less so. Over time, certain customs became absurd. One tenant owed 2 geese each autumn, unless the river froze before Michaelmas. Another was required to deliver bread, shaped like a fish, each quarter. A family in Yorkshire paid 5 turnips annually for the right to graze 1 cow on a patch of grass, no longer fertile. These were not jokes, they were rules. Custom, in this way, became both anchor and trap. It gave structure to village life. It reminded people what to expect, but it also locked them in place. A man might learn his obligations at age 12 and still be fulfilling them at age 60 without change, without question, without hope of escape. Historians debate whether these obligations were universally oppressive. Some argue that they provided stability, that they prevented arbitrary punishment. Others contend that they were merely a system of control disguised as tradition. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the comfort of expectation dulls the pain of exploitation. What is clear is that villagers knew how to navigate the system. They tracked their duties with pebbles, carvings, whispered mnemonics. They knew when the steward walked, when the reeve rested, when the lord rode. They understood the ledger's patterns. They understood which obligations could be delayed, which could be fulfilled symbolically, and which must be met precisely. A loaf delivered 1 day late might be forgiven. A candle with insufficient wax might be overlooked. But failure to report for harvest duty on the appointed day, that brought consequences. A man once fined for this tried to argue that his wife had gone into labor. The steward responded, "Then your hands were not needed in the birthing." Despite this rigidity, the manor court remained a place of negotiation. A peasant might plead for leniency, present his best bread, offer small tokens. Some stewards accepted, others did not. There is a story of a tenant who delivered his bread tied in a ribbon, alongside a song written for the Lord's dog. He was fined for waste of cloth. Custom shaped not just duties, but imagination. Children learned their obligations early. They played games based on manorial roles. One child became the steward, another the baker, another the reluctant tenant. The game ended when someone cried. Sometimes that was the child asked to simulate scutage, and through it all the oven remained. Obligations pulled tenants in every direction, but the oven stood at the center, literal and symbolic. It was the hearth of the manor, the place where duties and desires collided. One baked not only to feed, but to comply. Each loaf carried not just hunger, but history, and yet in secret peasants mocked the ledger. They made jokes about it over fire. They named their chickens after stewards. They shaped bread into rude forms when no one watched. Obligation could not extinguish laughter, nor could it remove the truth that beneath the layers of custom the peasant remained clever, resilient, and unbroken. He owed, he served, but he remembered. If the bread oven was the symbol of manorial oversight, then the market was its stage, a noisy, muddy, half-ordered performance of trade, gossip, and regulation. Medieval villagers did not merely live under rules at home. The moment they stepped into the market square, they entered another realm of expectations, this time governed not by firewood or flour, but by measurement, quality, and presence. It was not enough to have goods. One had to display them properly, weigh them precisely, and, when necessary, submit them to the judgment of the ale taster or the bread weigher. Markets were not daily affairs. In smaller villages they might appear once a week or once a month, aligned with saints' days or seasonal fairs. Larger towns offered more regular bustle, though the manor still cast its shadow. A tenant could sell excess produce, but only if he had met his obligations. One could not hawk barley in the square if the steward had not received his grain, nor could one sell bread if it had not been baked in the manor's oven, at least in theory. The moment one arrived at the market, everything was public. A woman selling loaves might stand behind a cloth-covered basket, reciting the ingredients more than once. Barley, not wheat, no stolen flour. Baked before dawn. She did not speak these words proudly. She spoke them to avoid the sharp eye of the market reeve, who strolled past with a stick, poking crusts and sniffing sacks. The market reeve was not the steward, but he served the same function in a different costume. His job was to maintain fairness, according to the manor's definition of fairness. He carried a set of official weights, sometimes engraved with the lord's emblem. If a seller's counterweights did not match, fines followed. Bread found too light, too small, too burnt, or too decorative could be confiscated. The lord's dignity, apparently, did not tolerate whimsy. Villagers understood this game. They played it with practiced grace. One sold the best-looking bread in the open, the odd loaves from under the table. A little too soft? Sell it quickly. A little too light? Offer 2 for 1 before the reeve walked by. An enterprising woman might offer soup with her bread, technically not illegal, technically not regulated. It depended on the reeve's mood and on whether he had eaten. Trade was not limited to food. Eggs, cloth, beeswax, firewood, even gossip passed hands. A man might trade a rabbit pelt for a pair of boots. A child might earn a piece of hard cheese for a rhyme. Barter filled the gaps where coin failed, and coin often failed. The manorial economy was rich in produce and poor in cash. Rules still applied. Weights had to match. Prices in some places were capped. A loaf of bread could not be sold for more than the lord had set. If demand rose and loaves grew scarce, the price remained. Sellers, knowing this, sliced their loaves thinner, made their measures more poetic than precise. A baker's dozen was not always 13. Sometimes it was 10 and a promise. The ale taster was another figure of importance, though feared less than the bread weigher. His role was to ensure the quality of drink sold at the market. He tasted from each barrel, spat into a ditch, and declared it good, weak, or punishable. A weak brew could incur a fine. A brew too strong might raise suspicion. A perfect brew, offered by the wrong person, could be accused of fraud. Brewing, like baking, was supposed to pass through official channels. Yet somehow, ale appeared in many jugs from many kitchens. Women dominated these stalls. They sold the bread, the ale, the cheese, the eggs. Men handled livestock and tools. Children carried baskets. The market revealed the invisible labor of the village. The woman who seemed quiet at home might haggle like a merchant. The boy who stuttered in the lane might charm a copper from a traveller. These were performances, some forced, some proud. Market space was not guaranteed. One paid for a place, often with coin, sometimes with goods, occasionally with favours. Arriving early helped. So did knowing the reeve's habits. A small gift, a joke, a crust saved from last week could secure a better corner. Latecomers were pushed to the edge, near the dung heap or the pig pen, where buyers walked less and sniffed more. Conflicts arose, of course. One seller accused another of watering milk. A man swore that his neighbour's firewood was damp on purpose. A woman claimed her stall was moved without cause. These arguments drew crowds, and the crowds drew the steward. He did not like being summoned over a broken scale or a bruised apple. He issued warnings, sometimes publicly, sometimes by gesture. One motion of the ledger was enough. Despite the tension, the market remained beloved. It was the one place where peasants saw faces from other manors. News travelled through these lanes: who had died, who had married, who had been fined for hiding goats in the lord's dovecote. No one knew how the goat entered. Everyone knew what happened next. Feast days brought more colour. Jugglers performed, monks preached, musicians played. Bread was blessed and handed out for free, provided it came from the manorial oven. No one wanted sacred crumbs traced to an illicit fire. On these days the reeve relaxed. The steward watched from a distance. Children ran freely. The bread smelled better. Some manors hosted markets within their own walls. The lord walked among stalls, pretending not to judge, occasionally pointing to a pie. The seller bowed, the lord nodded, everyone watched. These markets had fewer arguments, more pageantry. The rules were the same, but enforced with velvet instead of stone. One did not question a nobleman's taste in bread. One adjusted the crust next time. Punishments for market violations varied. A short measure might cost a penny. Repeated offences could lead to expulsion. In rare cases, a stall was overturned publicly, its contents dumped in the road. This spectacle was meant to shame. It often made the seller more popular. "Did you taste her cheese before it was tossed?" someone would ask. "Yes," another would reply. "It was better than the reeve's." Over time, clever sellers learned to adapt. They kept a set of false weights hidden under the bench. They used stale loaves as display. They sent children ahead to learn the reeve's mood. A happy reeve overlooked much. An angry one found faults where none existed. Some sellers partnered with others. A woman baked, her sister sold. A husband stood watch while his wife haggled. These alliances formed the backbone of the market. They were unofficial, unrecorded, but essential. They turned stalls into communities, vendors into families of sorts. The bread itself evolved in response. Loaves became smaller, thicker, more uniform. Creativity became risk. A loaf with herbs. Suspicious. A sweetened crust. Dangerous. A twist of shape. Only if one could explain it as tradition. Sellers memorized reasons. My mother shaped bread this way. It wards off cough. The lord's wife tasted it once. Sometimes these stories worked. Sometimes they did not. But the telling mattered. It placed the loaf within the world of rules, even if it bent them slightly. In this way, the market mirrored the manor. Both offered structure. Both offered opportunity. Both demanded submission, yet allowed subversion. And beneath every transaction, every inspection, every whispered price and measured weight, lay the loaf. The bread that rose in fire, cooled in fear, and passed from hand to hand like a question no steward could ever quite answer. Names in the medieval manor did not float freely. They clung to rolls, to lists, to fines, to whispered retellings in the lane. To exist as a tenant was to be entered into a system, one of memory, of accounting, and of mild punishment. The manor did not care much for who a person was in the abstract. It cared about who had paid, who had failed, who had overstepped a rule by an inch and been seen doing it by the reeve. Identity was a collection of entries, stacked year after year, like hay in a barn that no one ever cleared. Each villager had a name, but that name came with baggage. A man might be called Hugh, but in the manor court he was Hugh, who baked during Michaelmas without toll, or Hugh, whose pig damaged the barley. The court did not forget, and its memory was not forgiving. A woman could be Alice, widow of John, or Alice, fined 3 times for underweight loaves. It did not matter how kind she was, or whether she sang to her children while she kneaded dough. The steward's role remembered the fines, not the lullabies. Birth did not offer a clean slate. The child of a villain was listed as of servile blood, a phrase as sticky as it was permanent. He might grow strong, clever, useful, but if his name appeared in the margin with that mark, his options narrowed. A girl born to a woman fined for unauthorized baking might be inspected more closely when she married. Even in infancy, reputations began. This was not reputation in the village sense. The neighbors had their own memories, their own kindnesses and suspicions. A man might be scorned in court but trusted with firewood. A woman might be fined in court but asked to help deliver babies. The village remembered with its own heart, but the court remembered with ink. Records were handwritten by the steward or his clerk, depending on the manor's size. They were read aloud during court sessions, often in a bored voice, though sometimes with a theatrical pause. The steward would scan the gathered faces, call out a name, and announce the infraction. The accused, rarely surprised, would nod, shuffle forward, and listen to the sentence. Most did not speak. It was not expected. To argue was to invite scrutiny. To object was to risk a worse fine. Names accumulated footnotes. First time. Repeat offence. Denied responsibility. These scribbles shaped how the manor treated its people. A first-time baker might be warned, a second-timer fined, a third-timer, even if caught with a mere crust, was charged before she could speak. The system thrived on rhythm. Deviations were punished with rote enthusiasm. Some tried to escape this. A few changed manners. It was possible, though not easy. Leaving a manor required permission, and that permission often cost money. Even when granted, the steward might send a letter to the new manor's steward, offering a friendly update. Your new tenant once let a goat in the oven yard. That kind of legacy travelled faster than the tenant. A few changed their names. If their reputation soured, they called themselves something else in the next village over. But word travelled in other forms. Bread, for instance, revealed identity. A certain scoring, a specific crust, these were recognized. Someone always knew someone who recognized the style. That looks like Maeve's bake, a woman might say. And just like that, the new name became decoration. Wives inherited their husband's reputation, at least in the ledger. A man fined repeatedly for late grain payments might be noted as married to the woman who bakes underweight loaves. It did not matter that she baked for 7, all hungry. The association stuck. If a woman married again, she inherited the new man's duties, and sometimes his past. A widow might be briefly free of these connections, her name appearing in court alone for the first time. But if she remarried, the ledger closed around her again. Children were rarely recorded unless they caused trouble or performed labour, but their lineage was noted. Son of Alice the Fine, daughter of Roger the Absent. These notes were not official surnames, but they clung tight. A child might earn a new name in the village, but in the court, the old one remained. The reeve played a central role in shaping reputation. He reported behaviour to the steward, and his memory was selective. A tenant who helped repair a fence might be spared a fine later. A tenant who muttered too much under his breath might find himself entered on the roll for infractions he did not commit, or for ones he committed quietly. The reeve was, in theory, one of the people. In practice, he was closer to the ledger than the lane. Nicknames also shaped identity. These were not entered in official documents, but everyone knew them. Martin the Flourless, Joan Two Loaves, Old Tuck, who once burnt the steward's sleeve. These names carried more meaning than anything in ink. They explained who a person was when the court had nothing to say. Some villagers cultivated their nicknames like gardens. Others endured them like bad roofs. One woman, Agnes, called the Clean, was known for never being fined. She baked perfectly, paid early, and smiled at the reeve. But when she died, her daughter, young, braver, was fined twice in the first year. Clean blood, but lazy habits, the steward wrote. The nickname vanished. The fines remained. Sometimes animals carried names too. Pig of Robert, hen of Beatrice, dog who stole a loaf. These were entered not out of affection, but as evidence. A hen that ate grain without paying was still a matter of record. If the animal caused damage, the name of its owner entered the roll. One steward wrote, Beatrice fined for pig, who entered bakehouse, trampled fire, ignited sack. No one remembered the pig's name, but everyone remembered Beatrice's fine. Bread markings offered another layer. Loaves submitted to the manor oven were scored for identification. A line, a swirl, a cross. These marks were not decorative. They told the steward whose dough became whose crust. A missing mark was suspicious. A duplicate mark, intentional or not, was cause for questioning. Some women developed unique scoring patterns passed down quietly like secrets. These were not written in cookbooks. They were taught through practice, through watching a hand drag a knife just so. The court remembered every offence, but rarely a kindness. If a tenant offered bread to a hungry traveller, the court had no interest. If the tenant failed to report for labour because of that same kindness, the court noticed. It fined. The steward did not write, showed compassion. He wrote, absent without notice. Still people remembered the rest. They remembered who shared during famine, who helped during fire, who sang while kneading. These were not recorded, but they lasted longer than ink. Historians today debate the value of manorial court records. Some view them as cold inventories. Others see them as hints of human lives. Perhaps they are both. A list of names and offences does not tell a full story, but it tells a story. And sometimes that story peeks through the margins. Laughed at steward's hat. Said bread was cursed. Refused to answer questions about dough. These were moments of personality, of defiance, of humour in a world designed to flatten people into entries. A few tenants leaned into the performance. One man, known for being fined every quarter, began to recite his own infractions before the steward could. Another brought bread as apology each time, placing it on the steward's table without a word. The court never mentioned this in writing, but others noticed. They told the story long after, and so names remained. Some vanished into the soil. Others lingered on tiles, on rolls, on whispered jokes. A loaf pulled too early, a child named after a stubborn grandfather, a hen that wandered once too often. These became part of a longer tale, because in a world built on repetition, on rules, on bread, and its watchful inspections, to be named was to be known, and to be known, even in passing, was to endure. Bread shaped the rhythms of a medieval life, but the church shaped its meaning. Where the manor enforced the law of the land, the church claimed dominion over the soul. And between these two powers, the villager moved carefully, loaf in hand. A crust could be weighed by the steward and blessed by the priest. A baker might be fined by one and praised by the other. And yet in practice, these authorities overlapped so frequently that one could not always tell which judgment mattered more. From baptism to burial, bread appeared in ritual. The church taught that bread was sacred, not simply symbolic. It was the body, not a metaphor. The Eucharist, the small, round wafer offered during Mass, was distinct from common bread, but the division was never as clean as doctrine insisted. Villagers spoke of both with reverence. A child who dropped a crust might cross himself. A woman who burnt a loaf on a feast day might whisper a prayer before baking again. Bread was blessed on saints' days, distributed to the poor during fasts, and left near altars as offering. At Easter, loaves were stacked in patterns to symbolize the tomb. At Michaelmas, a round loaf with a cross was expected at every table. The church calendar did not simply dictate religious observance, it structured baking itself. And so, a woman might bake not because her family hungered, but because the calendar told her to. The rules of the manor were silent on holy shapes and ritual cuts, but the church was not. A loaf with a cross was considered protective. A twisted braid warded off fever. A dough shaped like a sheaf ensured harvest luck. None of these designs were found in court rolls, but they passed inspection most of the time. The steward might raise an eyebrow, but he knew better than to fine a loaf that looked like it had just emerged from mass. To punish it would be to question the priest, and although the manor held many powers, it rarely dared challenge the church directly. Yet the cooperation was not entirely peaceful. Tensions flared when the two powers made conflicting demands. A feast day might require rest, but the manor might demand labor. A holy fast might forbid leavened bread, but the steward might require it for inspection. In such moments the peasant stood between rule books, unsure which punishment was worse, the manor's fine or the church's curse. Some chose the fine, others the prayer. Most simply did what they had always done and hoped both authorities were too distracted to notice. Priests often encouraged charitable baking. A woman might be asked to provide a dozen small loaves for the poor, blessed and distributed after Mass. These acts were public and praised, but if the same woman baked extra loaves at home, not for the church, but for her neighbors, the steward might accuse her of operating without permission. Charity and commerce looked dangerously similar when viewed from behind a ledger. One priest wrote to a steward demanding leniency for a widow who had baked out of kindness, not profit. The steward, unimpressed, fined her anyway. The priest responded by naming her bread during Mass and declaring it fit for angels. The congregation applauded. The fine remained. Confession, too, included bread. A man who had hoarded flour during a famine might be told to bake for his neighbors as penance. A woman who had cursed her mother-in-law might be ordered to deliver warm loaves to her door. These acts, designed to soften hearts, sometimes hardened positions. The mother-in-law, upon receiving the bread, might report the daughter-in-law for unauthorized baking. Grace rarely came without paperwork. Monks and nuns baked in larger quantities. Their ovens were not manorial, and their loaves did not face fines, but their influence was felt. A monk's recipe might spread through the village. A convent's crust might be envied. Some villagers, hoping to emulate holy baking, copied their methods, only to be fined when the steward noticed a pattern unfamiliar to the local rolls. One such case involved a woman who baked bread in the style of a distant abbey, light, sweet, marked with a 5-pointed star. The steward, confused by the loaf, brought it to the priest. The priest, recognizing the shape, declared it suitable for Lent. The steward reluctantly let it pass. The woman, emboldened, began selling it at market. 2 weeks later, she was fined for excessive sweetness. The court roll noted simply, unusual flavor, possible deceit. The spiritual dimensions of bread extended into superstition. A loaf that cracked too loudly was considered a warning. A dough that refused to rise might indicate illness. Crumbs scattered beneath the table could foretell visitors. These beliefs did not come from the pulpit, but they coexisted with church doctrine. No priest preached about haunted bread, but no priest laughed too hard when told of it. Children were taught both catechism and crust care. A boy might be beaten for blaspheming, then scolded for eating without blessing his loaf. A girl might be praised for reciting scripture and warned against baking on a saint's feast day. The rules braided together like strands of dough, church and manor, punishment and piety, yeast and incense. Funerals featured bread as well. Some families offered loaves to the poor in memory of the deceased. Others left bread near the grave, believing the smell would ease the soul's passage. These practices were officially discouraged but unofficially tolerated. A village that feared ghosts feared hungry ghosts most of all. Bread also featured in stories and songs. One popular rhyme spoke of a baker who forgot to tithe and woke to find all his loaves hollow. Another warned children not to mock the steward's nose, lest their bread rise crooked for a year. These tales blended reverence and ridicule, a sacred mix. Church courts occasionally heard cases involving bread. A man once accused his neighbor of baking loaves shaped like the devil, claiming they had cursed his oxen. The priest inspected the loaves, misshapen, yes, but hardly demonic. He ordered the neighbor to fast for a week and bake only round loaves thereafter. The oxen were not discussed again. Despite occasional frictions, the church and manor often worked in silent tandem. The steward maintained order, the priest maintained belief. Between them stood the baker, usually a woman, usually tired, usually aware that her loaf might be judged by both men before the day was done. There is a record of a steward and priest inspecting loaves together, one testing the weight, the other offering prayer. The note reads, "Bread found acceptable to both." It is a rare line of harmony in a document otherwise filled with contradiction. Some villages held processions with bread. At harvest, the first loaf was blessed and carried around the fields. During drought, special loaves were baked and offered at the altar. In hard winters, children delivered crusts to the church door in hope of mercy. These acts blurred boundaries. Was the bread gift, plea, or tax? No one quite knew, but it was given. And always the loaf endured. It was not just food. It was symbol, statement, sacrifice. It was watched by reeve and priest alike. Its crust could condemn, its crumb could console. And though it was often torn, it was rarely forgotten. The manor counted loaves, the church blessed them, and the villagers, in the quiet hours before dawn, continued to bake. Time passed, but the rules remained. The steward aged, the reeve retired, the faces changed at court, but the oven still smoked each morning. The villagers did not stop baking because the rules had changed. They baked because they must, because the need remained, because hunger did not care who carried the ledger. Generation followed generation, and each one learned to navigate the quiet war of fire and flour. New tenants arrived, carrying bundles of belongings and an old name already marked by obligation. They asked where the mill stood, where the oven smoked, where the steward walked. They were told, softly, always softly, not to worry too much about the rules. Pay when you can, someone would say. Bake when they sleep, said another. The crust cools quickly. Do not leave it in the open. Those who listened survived. Those who resisted survived longer. Resistance did not mean revolt. It meant subtle shifts. A mark scratched into a crust so the loaf could be claimed without question. A fire built early before the reeve had risen, then hidden beneath ash. A child trained to spill milk or chase geese at the exact moment a steward's attention turned toward the kitchen. No axes were raised, no banners flown, but no power stood completely unopposed. Women passed down strategies in flour-dusted whispers. Cover the bowl when you see the priest. If the steward asks, this is barley, even if it is not. Make the first loaf ugly, the second one hidden. These instructions were not written. They were lived. Loaves were currency, language, defiance. A loaf baked in secret was not simply food, It was proof of skill, of courage, of quiet pride. Villagers gave them as gifts, peace offerings, tokens of trust. One neighbor might trade a round barley loaf for help lifting a roof beam. Another might share a crust with a child from a family in mourning. These transactions never reached the steward's ear. They were the heartbeat of the village. In years of famine, the rules thinned. The steward might reduce fines, the oven toll might be postponed, but the pressure remained. No flour meant no leverage. Some villagers ground acorns, dried peas, even tree bark. They made what they could and called it bread. The court did not always recognize it, but the village did. It was during these lean years that bread became sacred, not in the church sense, though the priests spoke often of loaves and fishes, but in the intimate way something becomes holy through necessity. A well-shaped loaf offered during famine was a kind of miracle. A mother who shared her crust while hungry earned a kind of reverence the steward's ledger could never reflect. Even in abundance, the rules persisted. If harvests were good, expectations rose. More loaves, more labor, more tolls. The villagers laughed at the steward's optimism. "Rain is not a tax," one man muttered, "yet he charges for the green." Still they adapted. They built new hiding spots. They baked in pairs, one to shape, one to watch. They shared news of the steward's mood, the reeve's location, the priest's distractions. If a new steward arrived, he was observed carefully. Did he favor soft crusts? Did he walk the lane before or after breakfast? These facts mattered more than sermons. And always the oven waited. A presence, not a tool. Its bricks held the history of thousands of loaves. Some had burst too early, some had been removed too late, some had cooled before inspection, others hidden before dawn. The oven smoked regardless. It cared little who paid or who prayed. Children made games of mimicry. One played the steward, another the baker. A third would hide behind a bush, clutching a makeshift crust. They laughed, shouted, occasionally cried. The game never ended. It only grew more accurate with time. Adults did not play, but they watched. They remembered their own first loaves, their first finds. They recalled who had helped, who had warned, who had turned away. They repaid those debts in quiet ways. A handful of flour, a turned back during inspection, a false statement delivered with perfect sincerity. As years wore on, the steward's record thickened. Names came and went. Some pages curled from damp. Some entries faded. The steward's memory, however, remained sharp. A good steward remembered which tenant missed payment last Lent. A great steward remembered whose loaves always rose too well, whose crusts were too consistent to be mere chance. The greatest steward said nothing but watched. Reeves, too, left their marks. One was remembered for singing during inspections, another for tripping over his own cloak, a third for pretending not to see loaves cooling on a fence post, then returning later to retrieve one. Each had his role, his power, his manner of enforcement. One reeve, old and nearly blind, was beloved. He claimed he could judge a loaf by smell alone. "Too crusty, 10 lashes," he joked. No one ever received them. Under his watch, fines dropped. Inspections were delayed. Bread became a little freer. When he died, the village mourned. The next reeve was younger, stricter. The crusts darkened again, and still the oven remained. The village changed slowly. Roofs sagged, then were mended. Children grew, married, inherited fines not their own. Seasons shifted. One winter the mill froze. Flour had to be carried from a distant town. That spring the oven worked without pause. The steward visited daily. Loaves were counted, measured, sniffed. None were spared, yet none went uneaten. The balance never broke, but it wavered often. A poor harvest meant tighter rules. A new lord might demand better record-keeping. A priest might preach against greed, then report the baker who smiled too often. Yet, through it all, bread was made, shared, hidden, praised, fined, and consumed. And with every loaf, the villagers told their own story, not in words, but in gestures, the way one folded a cloth, the way one cooled a loaf, the way one passed a slice to a child. These were acts of survival, but also of grace. The system could punish baking, but it could not extinguish care. In later years, stories spread beyond the manor. A peddler carried news of a village where loaves were baked openly at midnight, and no reeve dared interfere. Another tale spoke of a steward who married a baker's daughter, then abolished the oven toll entirely. These stories were not confirmed, but they were shared, because belief mattered more than proof. Hope was kneaded into the dough along with barley and salt. There were loaves left on doorsteps in spring, too large for one household, no names attached, no thanks required. Some said the church organized it. Others claimed it was a reeve with a guilty conscience. More likely, it was simply one family remembering another. Bread as memory. Bread as marker of who had helped and who had not. Historians debate whether the manorial world was cruel or merely cautious. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. The records show fines, names, totals, offences. They do not show the neighbour who carried firewood for an old woman too weak to rise. They do not show the mother who ate only the crust so her children could have the soft centre. They do not show the man who, fined 3 times in 1 month, gave his last coin to the boy whose father had been taken by fever. Those stories live elsewhere, in kitchens, in memories, in loaves shaped with silent pride. And so the village endures, not because the rules were just, but because the people were. They did what they must. They shaped dough when the wind howled. They lit fires when wood was scarce. They bent the rules when they could, broke them when they must, and survived either way. Because in the end, the loaf was not only a fine or a law or a weight to be judged. It was also dinner. It was also warmth. It was also hope. And even if the steward never understood that, the village did. Night has descended over the village. The last flickers of orange slip behind the hills, and the lanes turn quiet, hushed, as if the stones themselves are tired. Smoke curls gently from the thatch, and the air holds the final warmth of spent ovens. Inside those low houses, the scent of bread still lingers, tucked between folds of linen, clinging faintly to the corners of the hearth. The steward has returned to his room, boots left by the door, his ledger set aside with a soft thud. No new names will be written tonight. The reeve no longer walks the lanes, no longer listens for flower-ground whispers or steps in the dark. His lantern has been extinguished, his list of duties folded. The night belongs to the villagers now. Somewhere a child stirs and shifts in sleep, one hand curled around a crust saved from dinner. His breathing slows as dreams settle in. He will not remember what the steward said. He will remember the feel of warm dough in his hands, the way his mother hummed as she kneaded, the way the fire popped when the first loaf cracked open. These are the memories that hold fast. Elsewhere, a woman wraps tomorrow's dough in cloth. She tucks it near the embers, just close enough to keep it rising. She does not count fines in her head. She counts how many mouths must be fed. She has done this for years, through lean seasons, bitter winters, and the sharp words of younger reeves. Still, she bakes, because she must, because that is what is done. Across the lane, an old man turns over in bed, his back stiff from years of carrying firewood and turning earth. He murmurs something, half dream, half remembrance. Perhaps it is the name of a child long grown. Perhaps it is a line from a prayer. Perhaps it is the number of loaves the steward once claimed he owed. He does not rise to argue. He only exhales and drifts deeper. The houses are quiet now. No pots clatter. No goats bleat. No fines are spoken aloud. What remains are softer sounds, the creak of old beams, the rustle of straw mats, the sigh of cooling walls. The village does not sleep all at once. It drifts into stillness, a slow collective easing. Outside, the earth holds its breath. The moon casts long shadows over the fields, silvering the furrows. The mill stands silent, its wheels still, waiting for morning rain. The manor house looms in the distance, its windows dark. It does not see the loaves cooling on windowsills, or the crusts left out for neighbours who have little. It does not hear the laughter that once followed a steward's misstep, or the curse muttered when dough fell flat. It only waits. The oven, too, rests now. It is blackened with years, scarred with cracks, ringed with ash, but still whole. It has baked more loaves than any steward could count. It has heard songs, secrets, sobs. It has witnessed small rebellions and quiet triumphs. Tonight it is cold, but it remembers heat, it remembers hands. This village is not special. Its name may not be recorded in the rolls that survive. The names of its people may never appear in the histories written by those who never baked a thing. Yet it existed. It was real. It fed itself with labor and laughter, with crusts shared and fines paid and stories whispered behind doors. And that is enough. Let your thoughts drift now. Leave the manorial rules behind, the ledgers, the inspections, the tolls and the turnips. Let the reeve walk away. Let the steward sleep. Let the oven cool. Picture only the loaf, warm, round, wrapped in cloth. It sits on a table beside a candle, its scent filling the room. No one will weigh it. No one will judge it. It will be eaten by people who care only that it is soft in the center, crisp on the outside, and made with care. It is not perfect, but it is enough. Let that image hold. Let it settle behind your eyes. Let your breath slow to match the quiet rhythm of this village, this kitchen, this table. There is nothing more required of you tonight. Sleep, warm and full, as if the bread is baking still,